My name is Kinsley Parker. For most of my life, I thought silence was the price of peace, that if I stayed calm, did my duty, and kept my head down, the people I loved would eventually see who I really was. They never did. Instead, they mistook my quiet for weakness. They mistook my loyalty for obedience, and every time I tried to stand tall, they found a way to make me small again. The day my own father looked me in the eye and called me useless, not in anger, but in certainty, something inside me stopped breaking and started hardening. That was the moment I understood. Silence doesn't keep you safe. It only keeps them comfortable. So I stopped protecting the peace they built on my pain. And I promised myself one thing: the next time they looked at me, they wouldn't recognize who I'd become. The air inside the tribunal felt dense enough to choke on. The walls, pale gray and bare, reflected the cold hum of fluorescent lights, while the faint scent of metal and stale coffee hung like a warning. Every sound was amplified: the scrape of a chair leg, the shuffle of boots, the quiet coughs of officers trying not to breathe too loudly. I stood at attention in the center of it all, my palms pressed tight against the seams of my uniform trousers, my heartbeat sharp and steady behind my ribs. The insignia on my chest caught the light, and for a second, I wondered if anyone in that room could see the irony, the symbol of service gleaming over a heart they were about to put on trial. Across the aisle sat my father, Major General Raymond Parker. He was composed, immaculate, the kind of man who carried order in his posture and judgment in his silence. The rows of ribbons across his chest caught every flicker of light, as though the room itself bowed to his reputation. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me in years. When the presiding officer called for him to speak, the sound of his chair sliding back was the only warning. He walked forward with the same precision he had drilled into countless soldiers, shoulders squared, chin up, voice carrying authority as easily as breath. He spoke without hesitation, each word cleanly cut, honed to wound. My daughter isn't a disgrace to this country. She's a disgrace to the word soldier. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to flinch. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me, waiting for a reaction, a twitch, a tremor. Anything that would confirm his words had found their mark. But I gave them nothing. My body remembered discipline even when my soul burned. My father turned, walked back to his seat, and sat with the confidence of a man who believed he'd just delivered truth itself. Inside, something in me stilled, not rage, not heartbreak, just a cold, clean quiet. For years, I had accepted the small humiliations, the dismissive nods, the quiet comparisons to my brother, the way my achievements became footnotes to his pride. But this moment felt different. This was not a reprimand. It was an erasure. And if I had learned anything from the kind of work I'd done, it was that erasure had power, until you decided to rewrite the record. From the corner of my vision, I caught movement on the tribunal bench. Admiral Leland Hayes sat 3 seats away from the presiding officer, his expression unreadable beneath the half-shadow of the overhead lights. His gaze brushed over me once, then stopped. For the briefest instant, his eyes flicked to the side of my uniform, just below the line of the ribs, where the fabric stretched ever so slightly against scar tissue that would never fully fade. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tensed, the faint rhythm of his fingers on the desk stopped, and in that stillness, I saw recognition. He knew, not who I was, perhaps, but what I was. The rest of the room saw a disgraced officer waiting for a verdict. Hayes saw something else, a shadow from a file that no longer existed, a ghost stamped with marks that were never meant to be seen again. The presiding officer cleared his throat, shuffling papers. The sound of a pen clattering against wood jolted the quiet, breaking the spell for everyone but me. I stood there, every muscle burning with the effort to appear motionless, every memory clawing to the surface, the years of silence, the missions no one spoke of, the scars no one could acknowledge. I had spent so long hiding behind the stillness, letting the world assume my worth measured up to their imagination. Now, With my father's words echoing through the chamber, I realized something undeniable. The silence had done its job. It had kept me invisible, contained, harmless. But that silence was about to end. The presiding officer announced a recess. The murmur of uniforms rose like a low tide. Boots scraping, papers folding, the rhythm of controlled chaos returning. My father leaned back in his chair, satisfied, one leg crossed neatly over the other. His expression said it all. He believed this was over, that he had buried me neatly under the weight of his rank and the certainty of his story. He had no idea the grave he'd just filled was empty. As the room emptied, Hayes stayed seated, his eyes following me, not as an accuser, but as a man measuring what he might have just uncovered. Our gazes met for a fraction of a second, and in that silent exchange, I felt the faint tremor of the world beginning to tilt. By the time the door closed behind the last uniform, the noise was gone again. Only the hum of the lights remained. I exhaled slowly, feeling the sting in my ribs where skin met memory. Every word my father had said still hung in the air, but it no longer carried the same weight. It wasn't truth. It was ignorance dressed in uniform. And ignorance, I knew, could be weaponized. When I turned toward the door, my reflection in the glass caught me off guard. Rigid, expressionless, unyielding. I didn't see a failure standing there. I saw the calm before a storm that no one else in that room knew was coming. The real trial hadn't even begun. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a town where the sound of helicopters was as ordinary as the Sunday church bells, and where everyone knew my father's name before they knew mine. Our house stood on a quiet cul-de-sac lined with identical lawns. But ours was different. It wasn't the white paint or the tall oak in the yard that set it apart. It was the wall inside, the one that carried every medal, plaque, and framed commendation my father had ever earned. That wall was the first thing guests saw when they entered, and it was the only thing my father ever truly admired. Dinner at our house wasn't about conversation or warmth. It was ceremony, an evening review of the past disguised as family time. My father would sit at the head of the table, fork and knife poised like he was still in command, recounting Desert Storm as if it had happened yesterday. He'd describe the sandstorms, the precision strikes, the discipline of real soldiers. My mother would smile politely, nodding on cue, her voice soft when she reminded him to eat before the food went cold. Ethan, my brother, would listen with the wide-eyed admiration of a man raised to inherit a legacy, not question it. And me, I learned to stay quiet, to listen, to absorb, and to make myself small enough not to provoke. When I enlisted, I remember the faint glimmer of surprise in my father's eyes, something like pride, but filtered through suspicion. That feeling didn't last long. The moment I told him I'd chosen intelligence over combat, the pride disappeared, replaced by disappointment so deep it almost sounded like pity. Courage isn't pressing keys. Kinsley, it's pulling triggers. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The contempt in his tone did all the work. I smiled the way I always did when he tried to make me feel small, controlled, silent, untouchable. He mistook that for agreement. What he didn't know was that I had already chosen my battlefield, and it wasn't one he could ever understand. Years passed, and while Ethan sent home photos of his squadron and their polished jets, my world existed in dimly lit rooms, in code words and encrypted channels. In 2019, my assignment took me farther than I'd ever gone, to the barren ridges of Yemen, under an operation that didn't officially exist. Its name was Glass Falcon. Our mission was to intercept a weapons convoy linked to a biotechnical lab buried beneath the desert. The target was small, precise, lethal, a prototype agent that could wipe out a base in minutes. Intelligence said the exchange would happen at dawn. We were there hours earlier. But intelligence, I learned, is only as perfect as the people who survive to tell it. They were waiting for us. The ambush was fast and clean. Half my team was gone before I could react. The rest of us fell back to the bunker, where the samples were stored. There was no time to call for extraction, no way to fight our way out. I remember the heat, the smoke, and the sound of someone screaming through the comms. My own voice. Maybe. I gave the only order that made sense. Detonate the site. When I pressed the detonator, the world became fire. I woke up days later in a military hospital, somewhere I didn't recognize. My ribs were stitched, my lungs burned, and the left side of my body felt like it belonged to someone else. They told me nothing. My ID was gone, my comms deactivated. The only proof I was still alive was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the ache that told me I shouldn't be. When the nurse brought me a folded uniform, the name tag was missing. When I asked about my team, her eyes dropped. Killed in action, she said softly. All of them. And then she added something that made my pulse stop. You too, apparently. I asked what she meant, but she'd already turned away. Later that night, a man walked into my room without knocking. He wasn't wearing a doctor's coat. His insignia gleamed faintly under the sterile lights. Admiral Leland Hayes. I knew the name. Everyone in my branch did. But seeing him in person was different. He had the kind of calm that carried weight. He stopped at the foot of my bed, studying me like a problem that had unexpectedly solved itself. You did what you were ordered to do, he said finally. And because of that, none of this ever happened. He handed me a single envelope. Inside, one line typed on government stock paper. From this point forward, Captain, you don't exist. He spoke again, voice low, almost kind. Your code name is Raven. You'll serve in shadows now. I remember staring at him, trying to understand whether I'd been rewarded or buried. He didn't wait for an answer. By the time the door closed, I was alone again, with a new name, a new silence, and a body that no longer belonged to any record. They erased me from every database, sealed every report, and marked my unit KIA. Killed in action. Even my death was classified. When I was strong enough to walk, they took me to a facility with no windows and no sign outside the door. My orders were simple: analyze, advise, and vanish. No photos, no correspondence, no history. That's what it meant to be Raven. Somewhere back home, my father raised a glass to Ethan's promotion, telling stories of honor and courage. In his mind, I was either a disappointment or a ghost. Maybe both. He had no idea that while he toasted victories, I was in a bunker halfway across the world, preventing wars that could never be spoken about. He had always measured worth by the medals on a chest. Mine were carved under the skin. For years, I lived in the spaces between the headlines, in the classified margins of other people's heroism. The work was invisible, the stakes unspeakable. I learned to exist like vapor. There one moment, gone the next. My name never attached to the lives saved or the disasters stopped. And yet, in the rare moments when I let myself think about home, I could still hear his voice. Cowards hide behind desks. Kinsley, real soldiers stand in the line of fire. He was wrong, of course. Real soldiers do both. They just don't get statues. Sometimes, when the missions went quiet and I could almost pretend I was human again, I'd touch the place just beneath my ribs where the scars formed. They were thin, pale, nearly invisible now, but every pulse beneath them reminded me of what they meant. I had bled for a cause that couldn't bear my name. I had become the kind of soldier my father would never understand, the kind he could never be. That's the strange weight of blood and brass. One is inherited, the other earned. My father carried the former with pride. I carried the latter in silence. And as I would soon learn, silence has a breaking point. For 2 years, I lived in the gray, somewhere between existence and erasure. There were no medals, no mentions in reports, no proof that I was even serving. I followed orders that arrived through encrypted channels, executed by voices I'd never meet, under signatures that didn't exist. My world was made of shadows, flights that left before sunrise, missions that ended before dawn, names that disappeared the moment they were spoken. Admiral Hayes was the only one who ever appeared in person. He didn't speak much, and he never asked questions he didn't already know the answers to. I learned to read his silence as approval, disapproval, or warning, depending on how long it lasted. Every directive came directly from him, and every time I returned alive, I could sense he was a little surprised I had. Some nights, in the dead stillness between assignments, I'd lie awake listening to the hum of helicopters passing overhead. Their engines vibrated through the walls, fading into distance, leaving behind that aching reminder that I no longer belonged anywhere, not the world above or the one below. The sky had become both home and exile. In Albania, I almost didn't come back. The mission was simple on paper: extract a defecting scientist before his data reached the wrong hands. But nothing in the field ever stayed simple. The contact was compromised. The safe house was a trap. I made it out by hiding in a drainage tunnel for 6 hours, bleeding and freezing, the echo of gunfire still bouncing through the concrete. When they finally found me, I was barely conscious. Hayes was waiting at the outpost when I came to. He didn't ask how bad it was. He just handed me a cup of water, studied me for a moment, and said softly, "Do we ever come back?" I asked him that question, not the other way around. He looked at me like he pitied the fact that I still believed there might be an answer. "Not in the way others do," he finally said, and walked out. He was right. I didn't come back. Not really. When the program ended, they gave me a new file, a new name on old paper, and sent me home. It felt like waking up from a dream I wasn't sure I'd survived. My uniform was crisp, my record clean, too clean. The line that once defined my life had been redrawn, stripped of every scar and stain. Back in Charleston, my father opened the door with the kind of cautious politeness reserved for uninvited guests. His expression didn't change when he saw me standing there. Maybe he'd already buried me in his mind and didn't want to disturb the neatness of that grave. Dinner was awkward. My mother served roast chicken and sweet potatoes, the same meal she always made when she wanted to pretend things were normal. My father dominated the conversation with stories about Ethan's new posting, about the commendations he'd earned, the respect he'd commanded. My brother had become everything he once imagined I would fail to be. I didn't interrupt. I sat there quietly, cutting my food into small pieces, tasting none of it. At one point, my father glanced up at me as if remembering I was there. "At least Ethan never embarrassed the family name," he said casually, the way some people comment on the weather. The room went still. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to pause. I didn't look up. I just focused on the scar beneath my shirt, where the fabric brushed against the raised lines carved by shrapnel and fire years earlier. Every nerve beneath it burned, not from pain, but from the effort it took to stay still. That night, after everyone went to bed, I went through the office that had once been his pride. Bookshelves lined with military history, a globe turned to the Middle East, plaques commemorating a life lived in headlines. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe proof that somewhere in that shrine to discipline and duty, I still existed. Instead, I found a folder on his desk stamped "Confidential, Access Restricted." My name was on the cover. Inside, the pages were empty, redacted blocks where sentences should have been. A note paperclipped to the front read, "All records sealed indefinitely by order of M. Jew. Raymond Parker." For a second, I couldn't breathe. He hadn't been protecting me. He'd been protecting himself. He had used his influence to make sure my file, my service, my sacrifice, my existence was buried deeper than any classified document deserved to be. In his version of history, I wasn't a soldier or a survivor. I was a stain he'd scrubbed clean. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing against my ribs. I thought about all the times he had spoken about legacy, about honor, about keeping the Parker name unsullied, and now I understood. In his eyes, my survival wasn't redemption, it was contamination. He would rather have me dead in memory than alive in truth. When the order came a month later to appear before the military tribunal, I wasn't surprised. I knew it was his doing. The complaint had his fingerprints all over it, phrases only he would use, the same rhetoric he'd turned into sermons at our dinner table. But fear wasn't part of me anymore. You can't frighten someone who's already been erased once. I packed my uniform, the one still carrying the faint scent of burned sand and antiseptic, and folded it carefully into a case. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, almost detached. I wasn't thinking about vindication or revenge. I wasn't thinking about the humiliation waiting for me in that courtroom. I was thinking about the scars under my ribs, thin, pale, and unremarkable to anyone else. But to me, they were the last map of a life that had cost everything to live. Those scars were my proof. Not medals, not certificates, not the approval of a man who mistook pride for purpose. I buttoned the uniform up to the collar and whispered into the silence, just to hear the sound of my own resolve. It's time they see what they tried so hard to forget. When the official notice slid under my door the next morning, summoning me to the tribunal in San Diego, I didn't hesitate. I folded the letter once, placed it on the counter, and poured myself a cup of coffee. No fear, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that the story my father had written was about to be torn open. And this time, it would be told in my language. Not in reports, not in words, but in the truth carved beneath my skin. I can still remember that night in Charleston, the last night I ever called that house home. It was one of those evenings where everything looked perfect on the surface, like a photograph you could frame to convince yourself your family was whole. The dining room glowed with soft amber light. The silverware caught the shimmer of the chandelier, and laughter drifted through the air like it belonged there. My father was in rare form, commanding the room as if it were another briefing, not a family dinner. He'd organized the celebration himself, a promotion party for Ethan, my brother, freshly appointed major, looked every inch the poster boy for naval aviation. The white of his uniform blinding under the lights. Everyone congratulated him. Everyone toasted him. Everyone said the same thing. He's his father's son. The bourbon poured freely, golden and dangerous. I sat at the far end of the table, half in shadow, my glass untouched, except for the condensation pooling beneath it. I smiled when expected, laughed on cue, and waited for the night to end. Then, as if it were scripted, my father rose, glass in hand. To Ethan Parker, a real soldier who knows what it means to lead. The words hung heavy. Nobody flinched, but everyone felt the weight of them. It wasn't a toast, it was a message. My mother reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on mine, her fingers trembling slightly, her eyes pleading with me to stay quiet. I did. The muscles in my jaw ached from holding everything in. The bourbon glass shook slightly in my hand, the ice clinking like a metronome to my restraint. After dinner, I escaped to the deck to breathe. The night air was thick with salt and humidity, the ocean black and restless beyond the railing. The cicadas screamed from the trees, but all I could hear was my father's voice still echoing in my head. A real soldier. The sliding door opened behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. He joined me in silence for a moment, the sound of waves filling the gap between us. Then came the words, smooth and measured, the same tone he used in debriefings. The board is considering my 4th star. He paused, as if expecting applause. But this tribunal of yours, he continued, your so-called intelligence work, it's a stain. Kinsley. I felt my throat tighten. He never said my name unless it was attached to an accusation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, crisp and deliberate, the way he did everything. You can fix it, he said. Sign this. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind, but the words were bold and unwavering. Statement of error and admission of negligence. Do it for the family. The phrase tasted bitter. It was the same thing he'd said to me when I was 10, and lied to cover for Ethan breaking his school window. It was the same thing he said when he made my mother cancel her art exhibition because it clashed with a military banquet. Do it for the family. His words for obedience. I read the statement all the way through, the legal phrasing neat and clinical. The lie was simple enough. a formal admission that I'd mishandled classified information during a past operation. Signing it would make everything easy. It would preserve his spotless reputation. I tore it in half. "I won't lie for your stars." For a long moment, he didn't move. The only sound was the paper fluttering to the deck, the waves crashing beyond. Then he grabbed the torn halves from my hand, his composure fracturing for the first time that night. "Then don't expect me to save you when this blows up." His voice wasn't angry. It was cold, precise, like a scalpel cutting exactly where it meant to. I turned toward the door. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. For once, it wasn't me standing trial in that house. It was him. As I reached for the handle, I heard him behind me. "You'll regret choosing pride over blood." I stopped. The sea wind pressed against me, carrying the faint smell of salt and smoke. For years, that line, "pride over blood," had been the mantra that kept me compliant. It was how he justified every insult, every dismissal, every time he silenced me in front of others. He believed blood meant loyalty to him, but loyalty built on silence was just another kind of surrender. I looked out at the water. The tide was coming in fast, waves colliding hard against the rocks, white foam clawing at the shore. It reminded me of another night, far from home, Yemen, the mission, the explosion, the screams that never made it into any official report. I had bled for this country, bled for men who never knew my name. My ribs still carried the evidence, a web of scars beneath the uniform he now called a stain. And that same man, the one I had unknowingly saved, stood behind me, asking for a signature to make his own life easier. Something shifted in me then, the kind of shift you can feel in your bones, slow and irreversible. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter trying to earn his approval or the soldier trying to prove her worth. I was something he could never understand, someone who knew what truth cost and was willing to pay it. I turned slightly, just enough to let my words carry back to him. "You think I'm choosing pride?" I said quietly. "But I've already chosen blood. Mine." I didn't wait for a response. I walked back inside, past the laughter that still lingered from the party, past the photographs of Ethan's flight team, past the wall of framed medals that had once meant everything to him. Each step away from that room felt like shedding armor I no longer needed. He didn't know it, but he'd just handed me the final piece of resolve I needed. His condemnation was no longer a wound, it was permission. When the door shut behind me, the sound was soft, almost polite, but to me, it felt like the closing of a long, cruel chapter. Outside, the ocean roared louder, the wind picking up, as if the storm he'd warned me about was already building on the horizon. He thought he was reminding me of my place. He didn't realize I'd just found my footing. That night, for the first time, I didn't see myself as a victim of his power or his legacy. I saw myself as the one holding the weapon. Only mine wasn't made of steel or fire. It was made of truth. 2 weeks before the tribunal, the air inside the prep room felt too still, too clean. The walls were the same dull gray as the metal filing cabinets that lined them. The kind of color that seemed designed to erase human warmth. The hum of the overhead light was steady, but I could feel the tension vibrating through the silence between me and the young man sitting across from me. Lieutenant Reed was new. Too new. His uniform was still sharp enough to cut glass, his eyes quick and alert but untested. The sheen of sweat on his forehead caught the light as he shuffled through the stack of documents between us. He was trying to look confident, but the trembling edge in his voice betrayed him. "Captain Parker," he said finally, "the tribunal won't go easy on you. If you acknowledge procedural negligence, we can appeal for leniency. You'd lose your clearance, but they'd preserve your pension." He was careful with his words, almost pleading in their precision, like someone handling a live wire. I leaned back, studying him. He was what the system loved to produce. Young, idealistic, unscarred by the dirtier layers of service. He believed in rules because he had never seen what war did to them. I saw it in the way his fingers hovered over the paper, like the law itself could save him from everything outside these walls. "I didn't break the law," I said quietly. "I obeyed a higher one." He frowned, clearly not understanding. Directive Echo 7? That's a ghost protocol. It doesn't exist anymore. If you try to use it, and they don't believe you, it's perjury. You could be court-martialed for treason. Then they'll have to erase me twice. His face went pale, his mouth opening as if to argue, but nothing came out. The pen in his hand slipped and hit the table with a soft click. You're gambling your life on a myth. Captain, he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I'm gambling it on memory. That stopped him. He stared at me, unsure whether I was being poetic or suicidal. Maybe I was a little of both. He sat back, running a hand through his hair. I could tell he wanted to reason with me, to talk me out of whatever madness he thought I was planning. But he didn't understand that this wasn't a choice born of defiance. It was inevitability. There comes a point when silence stops being a shield and becomes a sentence. I had lived under that sentence long enough. I reached for the form in front of me, the one labeled Initiation of Classified Directive Invocation. It was a thin document, but the words on it carried more weight than anything else in the room. At the bottom, a single signature line waited. I signed my name in ink that bled slightly into the paper, the edges softening like smoke. Only agents who had been declared dead could use that directive. It was the final failsafe for those of us who no longer officially existed. And I, by all accounts, by every official file, was already one of them. When I pushed the document back across the table, Reed didn't touch it. He just looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and pity. Captain Parker, why? Because ghosts don't need permission to speak. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he gathered his papers in silence, the faint rustle of the pages, the only sound in the room. When he stood, he adjusted his tie twice before saying, more to himself than to me, that he'd file the paperwork first thing in the morning. I knew he wouldn't sleep that night. I also knew I would. There was a strange calm that came with finality. Fear loses its shape when you've already accepted every outcome. I wasn't afraid of losing my name, my uniform, or the last fragments of respect that tied me to the Parker family. I had lost all of that once before. This time, I was ready to let it go on my own terms. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled an old wooden box from the closet. The hinges creaked softly when I opened it. Inside were fragments of a life no one was supposed to remember. A photograph of 6 people standing in the Yemen desert, their faces half lit by a dying sun. A patch bearing the outline of a falcon, with its wings spread. And beneath it all, a single folded sheet of paper. Operation Glass Falcon, Authorization Directive, signed in black ink by Admiral Leland Hayes. I hadn't looked at it in years. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper, tracing the signature with my thumb. It was more than a reminder. It was proof that the mission had existed, that I had existed. As I studied the document, a chill ran through me. My eyes caught on a notation at the bottom of the page, something I hadn't noticed before. Review Authority, L. Hayes, Command Oversight Council. I froze. It meant that Hayes wasn't just my commanding officer back then. He was also on the tribunal panel now, one of 3 men who would determine my fate. I sank back in the chair, the paper slipping slightly in my hand. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The man who had ordered my existence wiped clean was now going to sit in judgment over whether that erasure had been justified. I thought about the moment in the hospital when he'd told me I didn't exist. How calm his voice had been, how certain. I'd believed it was necessity, an act of protection for national security. But sitting there in the dim glow of my desk lamp, it no longer felt like protection. It felt like possession, like someone deciding what parts of me were worth keeping and what parts deserved to vanish. If he didn't recognize me at the tribunal, the truth would die again, this time permanently, sealed under layers of protocol no one dared question. And if he did recognize me, the weight of that recognition would be dangerous for us both. I folded the document carefully and placed it back in the box, setting the photograph on top. Their faces stared back at me, my team, my ghosts. None of them would ever see the inside of a courtroom. None of them would ever be acknowledged for what they'd done. I was the only one left who could speak for them. When I closed the lid, the latch clicked into place with the soft finality of a trigger being set. The tribunal wasn't just about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Outside, the city was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the walls. I sat there for a while, letting the silence stretch until it became something almost alive. I thought about my father, about his wall of medals gleaming under Charleston sunlight, about the way he measured worth in stars and stripes, never in scars. He'd built a life out of appearances, out of victories people could clap for. But mine lived in the dark. That was the difference between us. He needed to be seen to matter. I just needed to be remembered. When I finally stood, I felt steady. My hand brushed the scar under my ribs, and for the first time in years, it didn't sting. It felt like armor. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until I stood before a panel that believed I was a failure, a liability, a ghost trying to haunt her own name. They had no idea how right they were. The air inside the San Diego military courtroom felt like it was made of gunpowder, thick, volatile. One wrong word away from ignition. The wood-paneled walls, lined with flags and brass emblems of honor, seemed almost cruel in their perfection. Every piece of polished metal and folded fabric screamed of integrity, yet here, in this suffocating chamber, honor was being dissected alive. My father stood at the witness podium, posture straight, voice sharp as steel. Captain Kinsley Parker abandoned her post during Operation Falcon. Her negligence cost lives. Each syllable left his mouth like a bullet, deliberate and merciless. I felt them land one after another, dull thuds against a body already covered in invisible bruises. I didn't move. My hands were clenched so tightly on my lap that the crescents of my nails pressed deep into my palms. Across the table, Lieutenant Reed fidgeted, rifling through files he already knew by heart, his jaw tight, his eyes begging me not to do whatever he feared I might do. The gavel struck wood, one sharp crack that echoed through the silence. The presiding officer looked down the table. "Captain Parker, you may respond." I rose slowly. The motion alone felt defiant. Permission to speak. "Sir!" Admiral Hayes's voice came from the bench. Calm, cold, official. "Granted. Speak, Captain." The room seemed to shrink. The air thinned. Every eye was on me, the accused, the fallen daughter, the cautionary tale. My father stared straight ahead, certain this would be the final nail in the coffin he'd been building for me since the day I chose intelligence over combat. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Section 41C, I invoked Directive Echo 7. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the murmurs started. A low wave of disbelief rolled through the chamber, uniforms shifting in their seats. A lieutenant commander from the panel scoffed. That protocol was terminated a decade ago. I met his eyes. Not for those who were never declared alive. Silence. The kind that carries weight. The kind that warns of a fault line about to split open. It was Hayes who broke it, not with words, but with his expression. His eyes flickered in recognition. The faintest crack in an otherwise impenetrable mask. A flash of something, memory, maybe, crossed his face before he caught it. My father's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, impatience wrapped in authority. "This is meaningless jargon. She's bluffing." No one answered him. I turned toward Hayes. My voice was steady, almost too calm. "Operation Glass Falcon. Authorization code, Raven 4. The words hit him like a shockwave. His hand, resting on the table, froze mid-motion. His eyes widened just slightly, enough for me to know that I had just dragged a ghost into the light. For a heartbeat, I was no longer in that courtroom. I was back in the desert, inside the bunker in Yemen, the roar of collapsing metal overhead, the smell of burning fuel, the shouts over the radio, and above it all, Hayes's voice, controlled but urgent. "Raven, execute fallback protocol. You're ghosted." I blinked. the memory folding itself back into the silence. Now, facing him across the years, I said quietly, "Sir, I never stopped following orders. I just stopped existing where my father could see me." The courtroom went still. Reed lowered his pen. The presiding judge didn't breathe. Even the hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade away. Hayes's jaw tightened. He set his hand flat on the table, the veins visible against his skin. His voice, when it came, was even but edged with something that didn't belong in official proceedings. "Captain Parker, do you understand the gravity of invoking a defunct classified directive under oath?" "Yes, Admiral. And I can prove my clearance." A ripple moved through the panel. No one spoke, but I could feel the change, a subtle shift in the room's energy. What had begun as a routine disciplinary hearing was transforming into something far larger, something no one was prepared to name. My father sat rigid, confusion flickering just beneath his fury. He didn't know what this was. To him, it was still a contest of will, a battle between his version of honor and my supposed insubordination. He couldn't see that the ground beneath him was already giving way. Hayes stared at me for a long moment. His gaze wasn't hostile now, it was searching. He was no longer looking at the accused officer in front of him. He was looking for the operative he'd buried years ago. I could see it in the way his eyes darted to the faint line of my uniform, the way the fabric shifted slightly with every breath I took. The scar beneath the fabric pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. He knew exactly where it was and what it meant. The rest of the tribunal waited, caught between disbelief and the creeping sense that something had just gone very wrong, or very right. When Hayes finally spoke, his tone was formal again, but his eyes betrayed him. "Proceed, Captain." I nodded once. The pulse in my neck steadied. This was no longer about defending myself. It was about unearthing the truth everyone else had buried to stay clean. The words came slow, deliberate, like stones laid on a path I could no longer turn back from. Operation Glass Falcon was classified beyond top secret. Every member of that unit was reported KIA. I was one of them. Directive Echo 7 gave surviving operatives authority to invoke declassification in front of an authorized commanding officer. I paused. Hayes's gaze never left mine. I continued. That authority was signed and sealed by Admiral Leland Hayes, Pacific Command, March 19, 2019. The pen in Reed's hand slipped again. A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably. My father's face drained of color. He started to rise, his voice sharp, the command tone slipping through instinctively. "This is absurd. You can't—" Hayes cut him off. Not with anger, but with authority that left no room for challenge. "General Parker, you are out of order. For the first time in my life, I watched my father fall silent when another man spoke." The presiding officer leaned forward, glancing at Hayes, then back at me. The air felt electrified. One more spark, and it would burn through the walls. I met their gaze one by one. I am not bluffing. Directive Echo 7 was created for missions that never existed, for soldiers who were never supposed to come home. I lived through one of those missions, and I have the scars to prove it. No one moved, not even Hayes. In that suspended moment, I realized what was happening wasn't just a tribunal, it was a reckoning between a father who built his world on the illusion of control and a daughter who had learned to survive without permission. I stood there, unflinching, the silence pressing down like the weight of years. I could feel the tremor of what was coming next, the moment the truth stopped being a secret and started being a weapon. And as I looked around that room full of men who believed they owned the definition of courage, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever they thought they were about to witness, they had no idea what was buried beneath the name Raven. The moment I stood, the room shifted. The scrape of my chair against the floor cut through the silence like a blade, and every head turned. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, the council officers, the recorders, the witnesses. My father's gaze burned into my back, steady, judgmental, as if sheer will could keep me from moving forward. Each step toward the center of the courtroom echoed like hammer strikes on steel. The floor felt cold beneath my boots, the fluorescent light above flickering just enough to make the air hum with tension. My pulse was steady, but the space between beats stretched thin. The uniform I wore, the one they wanted to define me by, suddenly felt heavy, too heavy for its fabric. The crisp white collar caught the glare of the lights, and for a second, I could see my reflection in the polished brass of the judge's nameplate. I didn't see an accused officer. I saw the end of something long overdue. My voice came out quiet, but it carried. Under Directive Echo 7, I submit physical verification of clearance. Lieutenant Reed, who sat behind me, half rose from his chair, whispering a warning that only I could hear. "Captain, please." "It's okay. Lieutenant, they need to see." I reached up and undid the first button of my uniform jacket, then the second. The sound of the fabric loosening seemed almost deafening in that sterile room. One of the panel officers cleared his throat, a protest caught somewhere between discomfort and confusion. My father's voice followed, low and furious. "What is this? What are you doing?" But I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I slipped my thumb under the collar and pulled it down, just enough for the light to touch the skin beneath. The room went completely still. 3 thin scars crossed over one another at my ribs, faint and silver now, but still carved deep enough to form the outline of wings, the emblem of the Glass Falcon operatives, a bird in flight enclosed within a triangle, the mark of the dead who were still breathing. Gasps rippled through the room. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Admiral Hayes rose so fast that his chair slammed back into the wall behind him. The crack of wood against plaster startled even the guards at the door. His eyes locked on the scars, disbelief widening them until the years seemed to fall away from his face. Dear God, the raven mark. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, hesitant, like a man approaching an apparition. You shouldn't be alive. Not on paper, sir." The words came out soft, almost gentle, but they detonated through the courtroom like an explosion. For a few seconds, no one breathed, no one moved. Then Hayes turned, his voice breaking the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "General Parker, your daughter led the mission that stopped a bioweapon strike against your own Marines. You were never cleared to know. Her so-called negligence saved over 3,000 men." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was shame, sudden and suffocating, the kind that filled the lungs and left no room for air. My father stood frozen. The medals on his chest gleamed under the white light, but they looked small now, meaningless. The posture he had built his entire identity on, back straight, chin high, presence commanding, began to crumble. The lines in his face deepened, his color drained, and the weight of truth pulled him downward inch by inch until he looked nothing like the man who'd raised me. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just the faint tremor of breath breaking against disbelief. I looked at him, not with anger, not even pity, just calm, the kind that comes after you've spent years bleeding for someone who never noticed. "You always wanted me to bleed for this country." I said, "I did. You just never saw it." Hayes straightened, his face carved with something between pride and remorse. When he spoke again, his voice had the ring of command that silenced every whisper still lingering in the room. "All charges dismissed. This tribunal is now sealed under national security." He struck the gavel hard, once, twice. The sound echoed against the walls like gunfire. Final, irreversible. The clerk flinched. Reed exhaled audibly. I didn't move. It wasn't victory that I felt. It wasn't vindication. It was a strange, hollow quiet, the kind that settles when the fight is finally over. But the echoes haven't realized it yet. My father's knees seemed to give out beneath him as he sank back into his chair. His hands, those same hands that had built a lifetime of control, trembled as they gripped the armrests. The metals on his chest clinked together softly, a sound that used to mean honor, but now only marked the weight of ignorance. The presiding officers began to file out, one by one, avoiding his gaze, avoiding mine. They knew they had witnessed something they were never supposed to see. something that would never make it into the record. The truth had entered the room, scorched everything in its path, and now it would be locked away again. Hayes lingered for a moment longer. When his eyes met mine, there was no need for words. He knew what this had cost. He knew what I had lost to make it here. As he turned to leave, the gavel's echo still hung in the air, fading slowly, like the heartbeat of something finally at rest. I stood there, unmoving, until the courtroom emptied. The bright fluorescent light still hummed above me, steady and indifferent. Across the room, my father sat hunched forward, staring at nothing. The authority that once filled every inch of him had drained away, leaving only a man who looked small against the enormity of his own blindness. His hands shook. His breath came shallow. He didn't look like a general anymore. He didn't look like the man who had built his identity from titles and victories. He just looked like a father who had finally realized what his silence had cost. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might look up, that he might meet my eyes, say something, anything, that could bridge the decades between us. But he didn't. He stayed there, staring down at his hands like they belonged to someone else. And I didn't wait for him. I turned away, my steps steady, my heartbeat calm. The gavel's final strike still echoed faintly in my ears, blending with the sound of my boots against the floor. It wasn't the sound of triumph. It was the sound of an ending. The trial was over. The truth was out. And for the first time in my life, my father's silence didn't define me anymore. He had spent years building his legacy on medals and myths. I had built mine on scars, and only one of us was still standing. After the final strike of the gavel, the sound lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. It reverberated off the walls, slow and heavy, until it felt as though time itself had stopped to listen. One by one, the officers gathered their files and left in silence, their footsteps fading into the corridor. Only the echo of judgment remained. My father didn't move. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling lightly on his knees, the veins on the back of them sharp against his skin. His eyes stared ahead, unfocused, empty. The uniform that had once been a second skin to him now hung loose on his shoulders, as if even the fabric had stopped believing in his authority. I watched him. There was no satisfaction, no anger left in me, only a quiet stillness that felt both foreign and inevitable. It was the kind of calm that comes after a storm strong enough to strip the world bare. What was left was neither victory nor peace, just truth standing on its own, unadorned. Admiral Hayes approached slowly, the weight of years etched into every step. He stopped beside me, his gaze lingering not on me, but on the man who'd once been larger than life. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You were never invisible, Kinsley, just classified." I nodded once. The words sank deeper than I expected, cutting through the numbness. For the first time in years, I felt the faint pulse of recognition, not the hollow kind that came from medals or approval, but the kind that said, "I see you." My father lifted his head then. His eyes were rimmed with red, his lips trembling as he struggled to find something to hold on to. You lied to me," he rasped, the words broken, more confession than accusation. "No, sir. You just never asked." He stared at me for a long moment, as though he could rewrite history with his eyes. But there was nothing left to say. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Defeat or acceptance? I couldn't tell. I straightened my spine and gave him a salute. Not out of obligation, not out of forgiveness, but because I had earned the right to stand tall, to honor my own discipline instead of his authority. In that quiet salute, something ended. The hierarchy, the mythology, the years of silence, all of it collapsed into dust. I was no longer the general's daughter. I was Raven. A month later, I drove back to Charleston. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that blurred the horizon where the ocean met the air. The house looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the presence it used to command. Inside, Everything was quiet. Too quiet for a place that had once carried the sound of metals clinking and stories being retold like sacred scripture. The display cabinet still stood against the wall, but the gleam was gone. Dust had gathered along the frames, dulling the golds and silvers that once demanded admiration. In the center, above the shelf lined with commendations, there was an empty space. The outline of a missing medal marked the glass like a scar. I'd heard about it before coming. They'd revoked his Medal of Honor, officially for false testimony, unofficially for pride masquerading as truth. It didn't surprise me. Nothing about him surprised me anymore. He was sitting in the living room when I found him, the light from the window cutting across his shoulders. The uniform was gone, replaced by a dark sweater that hung loose on his frame. His hair had grayed more than I remembered. He stared out toward the water as if it were something he could still command. I stepped inside, my boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. "I heard they took your medal," I said. "They did," he answered without turning. His voice was thin, stripped of the authority that used to fill it. Maybe they should have taken it long ago. There was no bitterness, just exhaustion. A man who had spent his life building something only to realize it was hollow. He didn't move for a while, then spoke again. The words quiet but heavy. I thought protecting the family name was what mattered, but it turns out, the family's name was protected by you. The words landed somewhere between confession and surrender. I looked around the room, the polished furniture, the flags in their wooden frames, the photographs frozen in perfect poses. None of it felt alive anymore. All the symbols of victory had turned into relics of a man who'd mistaken glory for goodness. "You wanted me to fight your wars," I said, my voice steady. "I fought mine. You just never saw the battlefield." He finally looked up. His eyes, always sharp and commanding, were soft now, rimmed with a kind of regret that didn't need explanation. He nodded slowly, tears threatening but never falling. "I was wrong about everything. It's all right," I said. "You're not the only one." For a moment, we stayed there in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't born of anger, but of understanding too late. I turned toward the door. Outside, the ocean roared against the shore, the same rhythm that had once filled this house. But it sounded different now. It wasn't a reminder of battles or legacy. It was release. The last pieces of his myth were breaking apart with every wave, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hold any of them. Honor had finally found its rightful place, not on a chest, but in what remained unseen. Winter settled over Washington, quiet and gray. From my office window inside the Pentagon, the city stretched out beneath a pale sky, the monuments muted by the cold. The glass reflected my own silhouette, still, composed, almost indistinguishable from the steel and order surrounding me. On my desk lay a single identification card, newly issued, Raven, no title, no rank, just a name that wasn't meant to exist, yet carried more truth than any rank ever had. I scrolled through encrypted reports, reviewing mission details, the rhythm of routine settling back into me like muscle memory. The cursor blinked on a blank screen until a new message appeared in the corner of my inbox. From R. Parker, subject, Kinsley. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The message was short. Only one line. I was wrong about everything. I stopped reading. My hand moved to the archive icon, and with one quiet click, the email disappeared. It wasn't anger that made me do it. It wasn't even pride. I just didn't need words anymore to know what I had already earned. I closed the laptop and stood. The floor-to-ceiling glass framed the Virginia trees, swaying in the wind, their branches cutting through the silver light. In the distance, the faint hum of helicopter blades rose, then faded, steady, familiar, like the sound of purpose continuing somewhere else. A black raven landed on the balcony rail outside, its feathers glossy against the pale sky. It tilted its head toward me, curious, still. I smiled softly. Mission complete. Raven. The sunlight broke through the clouds then, falling across my shoulder and catching the faintest ridge beneath the fabric of my uniform. The scar no longer ached. It wasn't a mark of pain anymore. It was proof that I existed.